Hello, everybody. We will call today's meeting of the Sustainability and Resiliency Committee to order. I'm John Strand, your chair. We have folks in the audience that we'll be hearing from later and visiting with, and we also have, I believe, 4 people online. So why don't we start, run around the table and introduce ourselves, and then we'll see who's online and go from there.
Good afternoon. I'm Brenda Derrick. I'm the city engineer for Fargo.
Paul Mathis with Cass County Electric Cooperative.
I'm Bruce Grubb. I'm Fargo City Administrator.
Ben Dow, I'm with Fargo Public Works.
And they let you off today to come to a meeting?
We're still running.
You're the lucky guy.
We're losing the battle still.
And we're just introducing ourselves, Dave.
Dave Leaker, Fargo Park District.
Okay, and how do we go to the folks online? If people want to say who you are and where that you're here.
Blake Mikesell, Fargo Public Schools.
Greta Greimig, Member at Large.
Casey Steele, Member at Large.
Jen Sweatman, Member at Large.
Who was the last one? Oh, Jennifer, good.
Jen
Sorry,
Sweatman.
Good. And Nicole, if you'd introduce yourself.
Nicole Crutchfield, Planning Department.
And while we're doing it, we have one more, and then we'll go to our agenda.
I got Nicole to come down, so I was just corralling people up.
That's good.
Tim Honey, Mayor.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for showing up today. I didn't know with the weather as it was unfolding today if we'd even be able to meet, but our street department got enough streets open so we could, and here we are. So thanks a bunch. We'll meet every 2 months. We've done the roll call. Is there any suggested changes or additions to the agenda? If not, I'd approve a motion or receive a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Bruce Grubb, motion.
Bruce moved, second.
Brenda Derrick will second.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed? I'll give time for the people online. Bear with me. All right, and then we have the minutes, approval of the minutes of the last meeting. If there are, first of all, are there any changes or corrections? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the November 4th meeting.
Brenda will move.
Brenda moves, okay. Second.
Bruce will second.
Bruce second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Okay, any opposed? All right. Today's presentation is one that I requested some months back, and it's because I'm sensing that there's a major discussion going on in North Dakota that will have a huge impact, I'm guessing, through time. And that, as I loosely understand it, began with the governor's declaration that North Dakota would become a carbon neutral state rather quickly by 2030. And that has opened, as I understand it, the floodgates of developments and projects and proposals and directions that people are suggesting that North Dakota go forward with regard to carbon capture and carbon sequestration. Of course, we all know we're a major coal and oil state, and so this notion of carbon capture would be a pretty profound impact on the world of fossil fuels in whatever way, I don't know. So I know Project Tundra is one of the major components of some of the elements coming forward. So what we've asked for, really, frankly, simply, is to learn what this is all about, to listen and try to glean as much as we can from the early phases of this development in the state. Kind of get a sense and a gauge, is it going anywhere? Where will it go? How far will it go? And then, of course, we will learn that there are pros and cons and people on both sides of every issue that we'd like to learn from. But my sense is we'd be remiss not to get our arms around this topic, especially in North Dakota, especially today, given the dynamics of the world and the conversations which are just moving so far with regard to climate change and weather cycles and so on, and what's our role and our place in all that conversation. So Bruce, and that was my little preface. If you don't mind, I'll turn it over to you. Bruce Grubb is our city administrator. He's really the point person for this committee as well. And so we'll hear from you and then introduce our guests.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you might recall, at our June SRC meeting, Paul Matthews with Cass County Electric, one of our members, gave a presentation about things that they're doing, efforts in the areas of sustainability and resiliency. And one of the things included in the presentation was something called Project Tundra, which, if I understand it properly, is a carbon capture project at the Milton R. Young coal plant. And so after Chairman Strand's comments at a couple of meetings, interest about carbon capture, Paul reached out to me and offered to invite Mac McLennan with Minn Kota, and I hope I got your pronunciation right, Mac, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. So anyway, and Mac was able to join us today so that he can give us a little background and project description on Project Tundra. And so with that brief introduction, I'll either turn it over to Paul to introduce Mac more formally. Mac, just want to thank you for being here today. I know you had to drive down from Grand Forks, and the blizzard was supposed to be over at 9 a.m. I was relying on Ben Dow to give me that. So, but thank you for being here.
Well, with no further ado, I'll introduce Mac McLennan. He's the president and CEO of Minn Kota Power. Minn Kota Power is our wholesale electricity provider. Cass is one of the 11 members of the Minn Kota system. So we'll get started.
Well, thank you all for the invitation. As Paul indicated, Mac McLennan. I'll talk a little bit about kind of where does all of this fit, and then specifically about Tundra as a project itself as well. Kind of where does it fit in the whole scheme of things. As Paul said, we provide wholesale electricity to Cass along with 10 other distribution co-ops, and that gray area you see roughly reflects from about International Falls to the west side of Devil's Lake, and then down just about to the South Dakota border. Our whole purpose in life is wholesale electricity to those guys, so I don't have any other function except to generate and transmit electricity to substations where Cass would take it here in your community and then deliver it to you at the retail level. You'll see there we have about 390, about 400 employees, and about 3,300 miles of transmission line. This is what our current generation portfolio looks like. So from a capacity perspective, so this is the ability to generate electricity. About half of our ability comes from our 3 coal units out in western North Dakota that we get from. We have 6 wind contracts. So you see those are primarily located here in the valley, and then we have one out in the west side of the state as well. About 8% of our resources come from hydro. Those are generally going to come off of the Garrison facility, and then 3% other. And what fits into other for you guys? So Fargo landfill gas fits in that little piece of other, and we have some other stuff that fits in there that we buy as well. So about half of our ability to generate comes from our 3 coal units today. So we would say to you that our members fully believe we're going to live in what we call a carbon managed world, and we're relatively intent in using carbon managed because I can't tell you today whether I think that means we're going to eliminate it, we're going to tax it, we're going to some portion of it, yet to be defined, but we believe we're going to drive down carbon emissions and that we need to find a path forward to do so. And that's what I'll talk about here in a minute is how do we go about doing that. Fundamentally, there are 2 ways in the utility industry to do it, right? One is to not generate it, and the other is to capture that which you generate. And so we have a little bit of both going on in terms of from a strategy perspective as we look at where do we go forward. One of the challenges today, you'll see on the bottom, and I'll show you, in just a minute is that each of the resources in a electric portfolio operate differently. So while we all believe, and if for me driving down today, you would believe the wind always blows in North Dakota. But the truth is, we have 6 farms, and in 2021, when we see the final numbers, I think we'll be somewhere near 48% off of those farms, meaning 52% of the hours in the year we didn't produce electricity from wind in North Dakota. It's hard to believe, but those are the numbers, right? And then North Dakota solar is challenged at times, and as well, because we end up with days like today when it's cloudy and otherwise gray for a big chunk of the year, at least in the wintertime. The other challenge we have in North Dakota, obviously, and today is a good example of it as well, is we get extremely cold. And so we have a large draw of electricity in the winter months here. And so you start trying to figure out how to balance keeping the lights on during that. And I'll show you, and it's not meant to be beating up on wind here in a minute, but I'll show you in a minute one of the challenges we've had in the last few years as it relates to extreme weather events. So this graph just represents, and you'll see on here, in 2014, 2019, and 2021. So the most recognized kind of event in the utility sector was what happened in Texas in February. So you don't have to go very far, though. So we all think about it as a Texas event, but your neighbors across the river had their lights go out during that same event because there wasn't enough capacity in the region, as well as we had a substation, Valley City, got turned out during that time frame as well. So there was a period of time there when, while we think about it being a Texas event, was really the entire upper Midwest and all down through the Southeast and in some cases as well. And so when those come, they cause 2 things. One is you cause a significant strain on the system, but secondly, you cause a phenomenal strain from an economics perspective as well. And so I'll give you a sense of what do I mean by kind of what's the strain from a physical perspective on the system. So I didn't use the 21 event. It would look almost exactly like this, only probably a little longer time frame. And so it gives you a sense in a winter event, and 14, 19, and 21 all look the same, is what happens during, and these are maybe extreme events, but that red line represents the capacity of our wind. So the ability to generate, represented by the red line. The blue line represents during that time frame when it was cold on the 30th through the 31st in 2019, how much actually got produced. So there were a series of hours. You'll see there on the bottom says HE, that's hour ending 7. So 7 in the morning until, say, 2 in the afternoon when the wind didn't blow at all during that cold spell. Right, so you end up, and that blue bar says max gen event is just a representation that during that time frame in the entire upper Midwest, the generation system was, and it's called a max gen event, but what it really represents is that the system was unstable. So at that point in a max gen event, we actually turn over operation of our system to somebody called MISO, who then actually runs the system for the utilities in terms of what you can and can't do under max gen events. And so at that point, we are prohibited from doing maintenance, we're prohibited from doing anything, and they're telling us at that point to turn on. For those of you who are on load control program, you probably got dropped as well during that same time frame. So those are the kinds of things that happen during that time frame. The other side of that is this is that same period of time, and that's our capacity again on the top, our ability to generate from a coal perspective, and actually what we were able to generate. So in 2014, 19, and 21, our saving grace, from at least from Minn Kota's perspective, was our ability to turn on something that ran when it got really cold. And secondly, because since 1970, we've been adopting a load management program, which allows us to intermittently turn off a portion of our load. And in fact, we can turn a third of our load off in the winter during the months for short periods of time, sometimes for longer periods, I think, than the consumers or members want, but it does happen. And that's, for us, is, if you will, a battery to be able to get through those events. And so as we talk about transitioning the utility industry back to more intermittent timeframes, and so I'll go back one, we have to figure out what to do on this graph when the blue line is near zero. and the load line, or it's really cold. Summer events, you'll see the same thing. When it gets extremely hot, you'll see the same thing. You'll see wind shut down at parts of time, then load at really needed. And so those are, as we work through this. So that being the case, one of the things that we looked at is there a way, again, back to this idea of there's two ways you can eliminate CO2. One is don't produce it, or two is capture it. And so, half of our portfolio today doesn't produce it, half of our portfolio does. And so we're looking at, is it possible for us to retrofit one of our facilities to be able to remove CO2? And that's the carbon capture side of this, right?
Matt, can I interrupt you 1 second? On that slide where that time frame, can you explain the difference, what happens to the price of coal versus what happens to the price of other commodities in the wholesale market? And maybe that's coming up, but I think that's a very important key, is what happens during that time and how different fuels are affected.
Yeah, so in our case, what Paul's asking fundamentally for us, because we are a mine mouth facility, meaning the mine, if you looked at this picture, is just to the left, is fixed over the course, roughly fixed over the course of the year. So our fuel cost doesn't ever modulate unless you have conditions in the mine like you have to take out more cover, or you have delivery related issues, or things that are unrelated necessarily to the fuel price itself. And so to Paul's point, our prices over the course of the year are relatively stable as it relates to the fuel side of this. So the picture represents, that's the Young Station. Nelson Lake is what you see in the background. Nelson Lake was built specifically by Minn Kota to serve the water needs associated with the facility. In the foreground, you'll see that blue looking drill rig. So that drill rig is located on the site where, if we're successful, we will put CO2 down into the ground. I'll show you that momentarily. So in our case, it's a stone's throw from the facility. So the current thought process is we'll store CO2 literally below the plant. And I'll show you a kind of footprint of what that looks like here momentarily. The concept here is we generate about, let's call it 6 million tons a year of CO2 out of that facility. And the thought here is that we would remove somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 million metric tons a year. How does it fundamentally work? So about 3 years ago, Congress decided that they were going to put in place a provision which would provide a $50 a ton tax credit, very similar to the way the production and investment tax credits work for wind and solar, in place for every ton of CO2 stored underground, right? So that tax credit, just like in wind and solar, help fund the economics associated with how do you pay for this. This is just something we use in terms of what are the economics locally for those individuals. So there's a substantial local impact. Obviously, folks in Oliver County, highest average wages in North Dakota, so they like to see the projects continue to go forward. This is one of the other pieces that I think gets lost in all of this. So if you think about one of the options that you can work on as it relates to continuing to have. So I look at our coal units today, and I look at gas in a similar fashion, although gas has its challenges at times when it gets extremely cold as well. But coal and gas generally will turn on and will operate at under command when you need them to in significant events. And so if I have to replace a portion of my baseload resources, meaning those assets I turn on when I most need them, or to operate on a regular basis, my options today really are nuclear and gas. And we're unlikely to build a nuclear facility unless we can figure out how to get them smaller and scaled and cost down and a whole series of things. So your replacement option, at least for a portion of my fleet, if I replace my coal units, is a gas unit. And so if you look at, this is meant to represent, so what are the number of tons of CO2 or the intensity of CO2 per megawatt hour? And so the left side is currently, so we generate about 23 pounds per megawatt hour of CO2 today out of the Young Station. If I were to build a simple cycle gas unit, you'll see it's about 1,000. Combined cycle, oh, is that me ringing? Combined cycle gas unit, slightly more, obviously more efficient unit, about 600 pounds per megawatt hour. And then if I put Tundra on the backside of Unit 2, you'll see down in the 200 or so tons per megawatt hour, pounds per megawatt hour.
That's probably somebody calling you to give you a question live
Right.
when they're watching your presentation.
I don't ever normally have my phone on anything but silent mode, so I'm shocked that it's ringing. But so the other side of it is if you look at, again, so if you take 6 million tons on average in a year and reduce that to 2 million tons, not only do you get then the tons out of the atmosphere, your carbon efficiency as it relates to what your removal, that's what this helps you give a sense of. If I take my coal units offline and I move to gas for a big chunk of that, I don't solve my carbon problem, right? At least today. We don't, there's not a, they're working on technology today as well to figure out how to remove CO2 from natural gas-based units. A little bit more difficult and much more costly on a per ton basis to do so. So this is what it looks like. It's a gigantic unit. There's one portion of this, and I'll talk a little bit about where we are from a project perspective. You'll see on the far right side, it says gas boilers. This system was originally designed where we would actually bring natural gas in to drive the capture facility. And the capture facility, you guys, to give you a sense of what it is, it's really a CO2 scrubber. You're really going to put CO2 through a mist. That's the easiest way to describe it. That mist will combine with the CO2, then you heat that, re-break it back out, and you end up with about 99.9% CO2. So that's really all that you're doing is running it through a chemical process, breaking the chemical back down. The output of that chemical is basically pure CO2. And so it takes a lot of energy to do that, fundamentally, both steam to reheat the gas, as well to break it back apart, and then a lot of energy to compress it. So when it goes into the ground, it will be liquefied. You're going to take a gas, pressurize it enough to liquefy it, and then it's placed in the ground liquefied. And so that complex is not a small unit. We'll talk about the cost here in just a moment as well. But that's gives you a kind of a representation of what it would be. And I talked about the gas boilers. We originally had proposed to do it on the gas side, to use gas boilers to do so. As we went back and looked at the economics on that, the fluctuation in the price of natural gas and the ability to get a large enough natural gas pipe to the facility made the economics not work. So now we are back kind of re-looking at the engineering to be able to actually pull the steam. So to take the steam from the units itself. So we can put it, before it goes through the turbine to produce electricity, we can swipe part of the steam off and run the capture facility off of that. So they're back. So the engineers are right now back re-engineering this with steam coming off of the facility rather than put a set of natural gas boilers on at the facility. There's three parts to this whole thing. So this is how we talk about it with our members or how we talk about it with our board or anybody else. So you got the storage side. So now I've got 4 million tons a year of a liquefied gas that I have to put somewhere, right? That's carbon capture and storage for any purpose, whether you're going to pull it straight out of the air or off an ethanol facility or a coal plant or any other industrial facility. So there's a storage component to it. I'll talk about where we are with respect to that. There's the capture island. That's the thing we just talked about as well. So that's the chemistry portion of it. And then how do you get the thing financed? So storage side. So North Dakota for the last 20 years has been looking at what is the what is the earth look like kind of below, and what is the capacity for it to store liquids. And so whether that's, so North Dakota, we've been looking at it for decades as it relates to can you store gases, can you store CO2, can you store water? And what we find out is that at the end of the day, North Dakota has ideal geology for CO2 storage. So the easiest way for me to describe what you're really talking about here when you're talking about storage, so you take, all of you guys have been to a beach before, or take a bucket of sand, pour water in that bucket of sand, and then take that sand in your hand and try to squeeze the water back out of it. That's fundamentally what happens in the ground portion of this, right? So you're going to put it in, it's going to fill the holes, it'll fill the cracks, it'll pressurize a portion of the system. and it's stuck between, so when we're talking about the two places where it'll be stored, one's 5,000 feet below the ground, one's 10,000 feet below the ground. Above and below both of those are cap rocks. So think about it. I have a hard surface, my sand in the middle of it, another hard surface. The idea is it stays trapped between those two hard surfaces so it doesn't move. So as a part of this project already, and for the application for our permit on the CO2 side, we drilled two 10,000-foot wells. One of them you saw in that picture literally right next to the plant, and one 5 miles west of the plant to look at what the geology is. So we pulled all the core samples. So you took the core rock down to 10,000 feet, pulled out of all of it so that the geologist can look at all the striations and figure out where would you store it, where will it go into the sand, if you will, in what formations. And so, which is all part of then applying for a permit, which we are in the process of, and I think are expecting to get a permit back from the Industrial Commission in January or February. So there's about, let's see, we must be on 3+ years of geologic work in terms of trying to perfect where does it go. So that's a storage aspect of it. It's just about all of the pieces of that are just about ready to be complete. The capture island aspect of it, so this is the part we are back kind of looking at the engineering and refining the engineering as it relates to making this switch from external natural gas boilers to internal flue gas capture. So Fluor is the technology provider. Most capture systems roughly look the same. Their proprietary pieces are what's the solvent they use, so the mist that the CO2 goes through has different properties for different vendors, and so that has its own set of proprietary purposes to it. And then exactly how they flow the gas through the vessels that capture it are a little bit different as well. And so you'll see there may be 4 to 5 vendors in the world who have capture systems or capture designs. The closest one to us is across the border at Boundary Dam in Canada, has a carbon capture system on one of their facilities there. Then the Great Plains Synfuels plant, which is out in western North Dakota, owned by Basin Electric, has been sending captured CO2 up to Canada for the last decade. So this is not novel in the sense that do we not know what we're doing from an engineering perspective. It's just a really big machine that has a lot of moving parts and expensive to build, right? So we are in the kind of, I'll call it, last months here of trying to figure out, all the engineering aspects of it to ensure that we know what we're looking at from an economics perspective when you put all these pieces together. Some parts of these are really big vessels, and so part of your economics are, can you build those here in North Dakota, or do they have to be built offshore somewhere, and then how do you get them shipped to North Dakota? So imagine shipping a big vessel from the Gulf Coast up here. How do you get it here? And that drives a lot of the economics. So that's part of what we're trying to figure out now, is how do you build the thing even if you get it engineered? And that's expected by August of this year. The last part of this is the finance aspect of it. So we are not, so as a cooperative, so I'm technically not for profit. So I don't have a tax appetite to start. So getting a whole host of tax credits really doesn't do me any good. So now it's finding somebody else who can monetize the tax credits. Same wind projects are the same way. So we have 6 wind contracts. Those are all held by somebody who can then monetize the tax credits because we're unable to because of the nature of our business profile. So we continue to see interest from the financial community and people who are trying to figure out, particularly in light of continued efforts to try to figure out how do you use the tax credits, but as well. So if you look at airlines today, how do airlines today fundamentally offset? Fuels is one way, so they're looking at our alternative fuel sources that produce less, or they're looking at offsets, or they're looking at other ways that you can direct air capture, which is to take CO2 out of the air directly. And then they'll do an exact same process that we're talking about at the Young Station, which is you'll store it in some kind of cavity below the earth. or turn it into some other usable product as it relates to it. So right now we haven't worked a ton on the finance side because it's hard for me to go ask people to finance the project when I haven't got all the engineering work completed to know exactly what the costs are. Now I can give you a thumbnail about what the costs are. It's about $1.2 to $1.4 billion to build the facility. And so then you have annual operating expense in addition to that. And so it's not a small feat. Now, one of the things that always comes up is we're going to put Mancota's members, which is a large chunk of you in this room, and others at risk. The reality is right now we have roughly looked at the potential for about a 10% stake in this, and somebody else will take the other 90%. So we're going to put some dollars at risk as it relates to the membership if it weren't to work. But we're not putting $1.5 billion on the balance sheet or on the people in the Red River Valley and Northwest Minnesota. From timeline perspective, our expectation is by the third quarter of this year, we'll have the final engineering design, the air permits, and then you'll sit down and work through how does the financing work, how do the tax credits work. There is a discussion going on in Congress right now to move the $50 to $85, which make the economics that much better, obviously. And then by the end of this year, our intent is to move forward with whether or not we construct the piece or not. It's about a 3 to 4 year construction window. So we've been working on it about 4 years now. So even to get to the construction piece of it, it's about 8 to 10 year project by the time you start initial concept to final operations. So this kind of what's happening in the utility space, but back to, and I think at the outset it was, so kind of where does carbon capture fit into this and why is North Dakota being looked at? And the primary reason, you guys, is geology. So North Dakota's geology as it relates to the ability to capture and hold things in the ground, it's why we frack wells to get oil back out of the ground. It's why we do all the things we do that are difficult to get liquids back out of the ground in North Dakota, because the capacity of the geology to hold all of that. So our approach has been twofold. One is to continue to add resources that don't generate CO2, and secondly, the other part of this is, why would you do this on a facility that's roughly 50 years old? And one of the reasons you would do that is because we spent about $400 million on these facilities in the early 2000s to do additional environmental controls and upgrades that we still owe on them. So I owe a substantial amount. And then over the years, we've done a substantial amount of work to keep them operating from an engineering perspective. So I have, even while 50 years old, I have a facility that has significant capacity or capability to continue to operate, for which I owe a significant amount of dollars on. And I got to figure out how to fill that gap when the wind doesn't blow from an electric perspective to be able to keep the lights on. So those are the basics, if you will, of why would we look at it, and then kind of where does it fit into the overall scheme. So technology is changing, obviously. So we continue to see costs on the solar side go down. Wind costs are still coming down, but turbines are having to get better to be able to do that. They're reaching kind of efficiency. They've gained, if you will, a lot of the efficiencies they're going to gain, other than size. And so you continue to see a little bit of efficiency gains there. And then the truth is, I think the holy grail for everybody in the utility industry today is what happens to the capacity or ability to store electricity, right? So the only product in the world today that we generate, transmit, and consume in the same instant. So that's a little bit about Tundra. Paul told me I had 20 minutes. I don't know how well I did to hold it under 20 minutes. I'm not generally very good about that, but so. And then I'm happy, Mr. Chairman, to answer questions about where does all this fit, or the project itself, or whatever it is you might want to ask about.
Thank you, Mac, very much. Let's start with our own group, and then we'll see. So we see we're out with time. Who has any? Go ahead, Dave.
So I was just curious, how much capacity does that one wellhead have, like on an annual basis? I mean, can you just keep pumping the liquid CO2 in there for 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? How much capacity is there?
So between the two sites, if we, and I didn't show it on, so the footprint right now from the geology perspective is say 6 miles by 6 miles. So you're talking about a 6 mile footprint on both sides, this well and the one that's 5 miles out, and they'll store 160 million tons is the current estimate. So that's, even if I can't do the math, that's 40 years. So.
Anybody else? And anybody on the phone, feel free to join in. Go ahead, Dave.
I
Absolutely.
got another one. So when you talk about tons of CO2, is that liquid CO2 or when you measure tons?
Yeah, well, it'll be the compressed tons ultimately that go in, the 4 million tons will be the compressed liquid tons. Yep. And so North Dakota's capacity is, I'll never say it's more than the CO2 we're going to produce in the state of North Dakota and even outside the bounds of North Dakota from a storage perspective well into the future.
Mac, if you're entertaining dumb questions today, I have one. So in my simple mind, you've got sand essentially where this is being stored. Does anybody know over the history of time, did that ever store something else that now the liquid carbon will occupy that space, or is it competing with anything way down there? You know what I mean?
Not really competing with anything, and I think over time, I think the thought process is it will ultimately I'll call it solidify and become will mix and become a calcium carbonate. Potentially over time. Doesn't compete with anything. So what we're talking about here there's no oil and gas interest here. Generically, you're not. You maybe have some saltwater brine down where you're talking about at that level, but you're not. You're competing with a whole bunch of sand or space that you're going to essentially put liquids back in. It will create, as a part of the permit process, one of the things we have to do obviously is monitor as well. So as you imagine, as you begin shoving lots of liquid down in there, you're going to create pressures. So one of the things you have to do is stay below, or I'll call them fracture possibilities as well. So we'll have to monitor all the time where the pressures are and how much we put in and what happens with respect to that, so that we don't ever approach any of those fracture points. So,
thank you.
Anybody else online? Anybody? We have Blake, Greta, Casey, and Jennifer. Feel free to join in. A question I have, Mac, as well, everybody's gathering their thoughts, is do we have time? The folks in the world out there are looking at this as absolutely an impending doom, potentially, and they suggest we just don't have any luxury of time. When we're talking 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, is that adequate, or what are your thoughts on compressing the time frame if this were to go forward relative to the world demand of immediate action with regard to climate?
Yeah, so not really an easy answer, but the other side of it is if we shut them all down today, we don't have the capacity to keep the lights on, right? So whether it's we use this time frame to allow the replacement of that, or you fundamentally figure out that it works like you intended for it to do and you can leave a portion of that in, you don't have to build new associated with it. But the reality is if we just shut it off today in our region, we wouldn't have electricity today, or at least for parts of the year. So there's going to be some period of time, even in a transition, that CO2 generating assets are going to continue to be on the system until we can make that switch, right? And even if we make the switch, I was talking to Paul about this a little bit beforehand, we don't have the capacity right now to move electricity well enough. So let's say that we put a significant amount of additional wind in North Dakota. One challenge with that is generally in North Dakota when the wind blows, it blows relatively consistently across the state. So it'll change over time. You'll see a front come through and it'll blow more on the west side or the east side, but generally going to blow in a similar fashion, and it's all going to shut off roughly at the same time too. And so the idea that well, let's just solve it in North Dakota by now. Having said that, sometimes when the wind isn't blowing, the sun is shining. But we have to figure out how you get that much capacity put in place, and that's going to take time regardless of what we do, right? So there's no way to just turn them off and have a replacement today in the scheme of what we're talking about. We can't store it well enough today to be able to do so.
The governor at times says this carbon storage is going to take a big part of our economy and the community of the state of North Dakota. So you have a certain capacity. What, in comparison to the state's capacity, is that 5-10%, or is that a big part, or is it a little?
I don't know the answer to that, Tim. So I can send it back. So EERC has done an analysis of what is the capacity in North Dakota to store CO2, and we are at, I don't know that we would even show
part
up.
of that. Second question, we've talked about hydrogen fuel as well. You're doing all this stuff, and it's energy, it takes a lot of energy to do that. If they then do the next step and do hydrogen production, is that, again, incrementally quite a bit of energy to do that?
Yep. And it has a CO2 footprint. So what they're talking about on the west side of the state as well, on the hydrogen side, is they have to have a CO2 capture storage facility, exactly like we were talking about permitting. Now, there's a different way to do hydrogen, which is still takes a significant amount of energy, but the theory being we'll use the renewable resources for the energy, which causes the electrolysis to ultimately end up creating hydrogen out of that process. But you're still got a tremendous amount of energy to produce another product that allows you to use it differently. So in a car or in a,
I know John thinks natural gas is just being basically burned right now, and that could be used partially to take your energy needs to do the steam and such. Is that part of the game? Yeah. Okay.
So each fuel source, for whatever it is you're going to use it for the production of energy, has its own unique set of challenges, right? So sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow. Fossil-based assets have emissions. So each water has challenges in that, you're not going to build, I don't think, at least in the U.S., very many more dams. I think we can improve some of the ones we have from an efficiency perspective. So we're somewhat constrained by we need technology to change or to get more efficient to be able to ultimately get where I think people would like to see from the electric sector. Adding to that, I would tell you is, so we keep talking about how do we reduce, if you will, the CO2 side of it, but then on the very flip side of that is how do we beneficially electrify everything, right? So when we start driving demand up and we start driving resources down, or the mix in how the resources change, we're going to put a significant amount of pressure on the utility system. And so one of the other challenges I think you're going to see utilities face over the next little bit is how do you continue to maintain affordability? And this has nothing to do with anything other than basic economics. When demand goes up and supply goes down, or supply changes, you're going to create, from a basic economics, pressures on the cost side.
The other question is, when Texas had its issue and had that grit issue, somebody said, well, North Dakota will never have that happen because we're very resilient and we have opportunities to get over that. Are we being a little bit coy that we really don't necessarily are as resilient? 30 below zero, ice on the lines, knocking down some of the transmission. Are we just as vulnerable as Texas?
Yes and no. So the system is all tied together, and so we're just as vulnerable, if you will, from it's a big machine with lots of parts, and they don't always necessarily operate in the way that they're supposed to. The second side of that, though, is in our region we have, I'll call it a different concept around how do you ensure you have electricity. So Texas operates in a market just like we all do, but they also operate in what's called a no capacity market, meaning they don't have to demonstrate they have enough electricity on the peak day as a utility to be able to operate in the market, right? They use a different construct, and so and their construct is really, and ours is too, at some point, kind of driven by ultimately economics will have somebody build something. The other side of it is, not to beat up my friends in Texas, but an example, so we up here put cold weather apparatus on essentially everything we do, wind turbines, most pieces, parts. One of the reasons Texas got in trouble was, a huge chunk of their wind farms shut down because it got too cold and they're not, I'll call them weather hardened. A huge chunk of their gas facilities. So here you'll notice all the power plants in North Dakota, most facilities in North Dakota are built to keep heat in, right? Most of the facilities in the southern part of the United States are built to keep heat out. So when it gets cold, one of the things that happens is they freeze up because they're not weather hardened. Because they generally are trying to figure out what to do on a 100-degree day, not on a 36 or 32-degree day or 28-degree day when stuff starts to freeze. So we tend to harden our facilities up here a little bit more than they did down there, but I don't want anyone to ever believe that we can't have blackout light conditions like they did in Texas up here. We can, right? It's a fragile system. The other part of it that I think people don't recognize necessarily is we do have transmission constraints up here as well. And we have other things that are going on that I think people don't recognize. I shared with Cass's board in September. I'll give you an example of just things that change in the course of weeks or months. So in September of this year, Manitoba Hydro, which has a phenomenal amount of hydroelectricity up off the Canadian dams, so they are facing drought conditions. Generally, Manitoba Hydro injects 1,000 megawatts of electricity into the MISO marketplace. On September 1st, Manitoba Hydro took 1,000 megawatts out of it. So we had a 2,000 megawatt swing right here in our region in September. And so Manitoba Hydro right now is continuing to draw out of the system, not put into the system. Right, so those kinds of things and how the system work all impact how does electricity flow, what happens if you lose a significant line, what happens, all of those things. So we are vulnerable from the perspective that we have a lot of assets that are exposed to weather, just like the Texas guys were. We tend to, I think, do a better job up here, primarily because 6 months out of the year it's cold, and so we have gotten accustomed to the idea of building around our environment. And the reason they don't do it down there, one of the reasons they don't do it is they generally have a more temperate climate, and they generally just don't want to make the investments.
Anybody else? So Mac, I'm curious your thoughts on this. We have folks in the community who have shown up that are particularly interested in this topic, and have presented us some topics to consider regarding feasibility, financial feasibility, safety, sustainability, and so on. And of course, they're going to have an opportunity to have public comment too. Do you want to stay at the mic, or do you want to just relinquish the chair and let them have their thoughts, or do you want to maybe be able to dialogue? I don't want to blindside you.
It's whatever works best for you. I'm not unaware of all the arguments, right? I have to make all the arguments back to even the people who own us at times about how does that stuff work. So it's whatever works best I'll stand up here, I'll sit back.
Why don't you stay there, and that way if there's an opportunity for a moment for us to learn and listen to each other and interact, that's great. Before we go to the public, are there any other folks around the table or on the phone? Okay. Who would like to speak from the audience? We'll go to the public comment next. Go right on up to the microphone, introduce yourselves, and we'll just cut to the chase and get your thoughts out, and we'll go forward.
Okay. I'm Jake Lauer, professor in electrical engineering at North Dakota State University and a citizen of Fargo. Got a couple of questions. One, I question the feasibility of Project Tundra. Carbon capture has been tried in the past, and all the projects have failed financially and also failed to meet their CO2 capture targets. Petronova near Houston, Texas was closed in 2020 after only 3 years of operation. Boundary Dam Unit 3 in Saskatchewan, Canada operated for 4 years through 2018. at which point the minister in charge of this plant stated that, quote, "there's not a business case for retrofitting any more coal plants with carbon capture and storage." Yet we're told that Project Tundra will succeed where others have failed. Why should we believe that this time it'll be different, especially when the engineering company that tasked with building Project Tundra has pulled out? We're concerned about the proximity of the fracking industry. The purpose of fracking is to create cracks in the earth to release stored gases and liquids. That's incompatible with carbon capture and storage, where we're trying to store the gas underground, not release it. Wind and solar are large industries in North Dakota which have lower levelized costs than coal, as well as zero CO2 emissions. Coal, which is 2/3 of Minnesota's capacity, does not work well with wind and solar. Coal plants are inflexible. They cannot be cycled to accommodate the changes in the energy produced by the wind and solar plants. This inflexibility causes utilities to continue to operate their coal plants, even when the energy isn't needed, causing them to occasionally sell energy at a loss. Project Tundra only makes the situation worse. By spending $1.2 billion on retrofitting a coal plant, you simply have to keep the plant operating to recoup your investment. Project Tundra makes Minnesota's power less flexible and less compatible with wind and solar, not more. Finally, with Project Tundra, you're spending $1.2 billion to reduce the energy output of a power plant, not increase it. Carbon capture and storage process uses vast amounts of energy. Our best estimate is about 40% of the energy produced will be used just for carbon capture and storage. With the adoption of electric vehicles, we're going to need more power, not less. Why would you spend $1.2 billion to reduce the output of a power plant by 40% when you need more power?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions in there. I maybe not get all of them, but I'll get the crux of them. So I'll start with a couple of them. So you are right, it uses a significant amount of energy, but it preserves our capacity. So there are two products that we're fundamentally always concerned about: capacity, which is the ability to have energy available. And so if I take the units offline, that capacity, if you will, I'm going to have to replace, right? Either from a regulatory perspective or just from a compliance perspective to be able to meet my obligations to MISO. So one of the things we're doing, at least at Tundra, is to preserve the capacity. So I don't have to make an additional capacity investment in addition when I do that. So one part of it, yes, it will use a significant amount of energy, but the ability when you have a really cold day to shut the capture unit down and use the capacity is one of the things that we're keeping kind of in place, if you will. Talk a little bit about kind of what's happened to projects before us, and Petronova is the one most, is the last plant built. And it's the plant I think people use the most as a reference point. So for those of you who aren't aware of what Petronova is a facility that captures about 200 megawatts equivalent. So at the Young station, we're talking about capturing 400 megawatt equivalent CO2. So there it's about half the size. One of the reasons that Petronova isn't operating today doesn't have anything to do with the fact it doesn't work, is Petronova's economics were built off of enhanced oil recovery. So at the time Petronova was built, there was no 45Q, there's no tax credits available to that. So they built their entire business plan around the capacity for CO2 to produce more oil, and that oil barrels, if you will, paid for the project. So then oil went to $30 a barrel, and the economics to do enhanced oil recovery for the purposes of that. So Petronova is shut down today. It's being pursued to be purchased today and then retrofitted, and there's a discussion going on about whether or not it will be eligible for 45Q, at which point the economics will change, I think, and you'll see it come back online. So Petronova is not necessarily a good model to use if what you're doing is using it to say it doesn't work on that side. Its economics were built on a completely different set of circumstances. So you are right in the sense that the part of the way that Tundra works is for the coal plants to operate. Today, to give you a sense of from a capacity perspective or what availability perspective, today we run those facilities north of 80% of the time today. We take them offline generally just for maintenance purposes, and then if you have what are called negative LMP conditions or negative market prices, then you get negative market prices because of transmission constraints in North Dakota, and so we'll back them off. Otherwise, the fuel portion, if you will, of our coal units, or the equivalent measured against the production of energy, we have really low-cost units from that perspective, which is one of the other reasons to try to hold on to figuring out how, when you need both capacity and energy, to do so. Last part of it is, not necessarily, but to try to figure out is why would we look at it for this facility is because I have a replacement option, and so I know that there is some thought that we can somehow fundamentally replace baseload assets with some combination of wind and solar and batteries, and so there's an expense to that as well. So now I have to close down a facility that I have a significant amount of investment in that still has useful life, and then replace that ultimately with a whole nother set of capital. And so from members' perspective, a huge chunk of Tundra is, and this is, we can like or not like this, is picked up fundamentally through the tax credit side or the federal government. The federal government tax benefits on it, and not for the folks here, if you will, in terms of our membership. There is some, not unlike what happens on the wind and solar side as it relates to the tax credits there. One of the affordability reasons for wind today is because it gets about half of its costs paid for through a tax credit. So.
Thank you for being willing to answer these questions. Ed, are you next? Sure. This is terrific dialogue. I'm learning, and it's gracious of you to be able to listen to citizens as well.
Sure.
Thank you, Commissioner, for allowing me to speak today. I'm Ed Grishella. I'm a resident of Fargo, North Dakota. I was struck by something Commissioner Strand said is, do we have time? And of course, I'm a climate change, what do you call me? Anyway, I spend a lot of time looking at climate change and what we can do about it. And the time that we have left before we have catastrophic meltdowns isn't that much. The earliest ones are saying 2030, maybe 2040, but I don't think we have time for this. We're at 420 parts per million in the atmosphere now. If you remember, Bill McKibben back 20 years ago said 350 was at 350.org, that's where that got started, that was a tipping point. That's when our environment's going to start to melt down. Well, we're beyond that, and we're climbing every day. So I'm more interested in things that are going to bring down the parts per million. These coal plants have been putting pollution into our atmosphere for 40, 50 years since they've been built. And I think it's some of that's got to get taken out of there also. Yes, we can mitigate some of the 90% of what we're going to burn out of the new coal that's getting burnt, but we're not going to do a thing about what's up there already. And we have to do both. Anyway, I have some concerns about the financing of the feasibility of this project, Tundra. Senator Kramer started what he calls the Bully Pulpit series, speaker series, where he brings in influential leaders to come to North Dakota to discuss our issues. He has spoken to leaders of major financial institutions. The CEOs of Goldman Sachs and Bank of America were brought in and asked to finance Project Tundra. Their responses don't bode well for Project Tundra. Neither CEO endorsed funding North Dakota's CCS projects. The CEO of Goldman Sachs bluntly told Senator Kramer, quote, "You know the reality that I think we all have to accept. The institutional capital world is done with coal. The Bank of North Dakota only agreed to fund Project Tundra if the state of North Dakota guaranteed the loan and it does not appear on their books. The burning question is, if no bank is willing to risk their dollars on Project Tundra, why should the taxpayers of North Dakota?" I was in the legislature when we created the Legacy Fund. And some of those dollars in that Legacy Fund now are ours. They're all ours. They're North Dakota tax dollars. And I think this is not the place to be spending them to improve the, I would rather see that money spent on something, again, to improve the environment, to take out what's already there. Unlike Minn Kota, other utilities are transitioning away from coal towards proven technologies. In 2013, Minnesota Power decided to phase out its contract to purchase 227 megawatts from Milton Young Unit 2 by 2026, as part of a plan for meeting Minnesota's goals for greenhouse gas reductions. Minnesota Power has used imagination and innovation in rebalancing its generation fleet. Young 2, a major source of coal-based generation, is being replaced by wind energy in Minnesota. Their preferred plan continues the transition of Minnesota Power's transition of their fleet to be more diverse, flexible, and to lower emissions. It protects affordability, preserves reliability, and sustains environmental stewardship. Last year, Great River Energy announced that it was closing its Coal Creek plant in North Dakota, replacing it with 1,100 megawatts of new wind power. GRE said that its plan to phase out coal resources, add significant renewable energy, and explore grid-scale battery storage would significantly reduce its member owner supply costs. So they're looking at renewable energy and grid battery storage. The GRE executive officer, David Sago, said that the real driver for the decision to close Coal Creek in favor of wind and storage is economics. Now, under geologic storage, I was just going to throw this in. The upheaval in the oil and gas sector may make geologic storage appear less risky, but there are plenty of potential pitfalls, which I'm sure you're aware of. In particular, without potential oil or CO2 sales revenue, Project Tundra will be forced to finance its entire capital costs through the tax equity market. There, the project will have to compete for financing with more developed, less risky sectors, notably wind and solar generation. These well-established renewable energy sectors are seen as low risk and reliable performance, traits that would not be attributed to a large, first of its kind, underground carbon storage project. This would inevitably force Project Tundra's developers to pay more to raise capital for construction. Raising these funds in the next several years is likely to be even more difficult for untested CCS projects, given the overall slowdown in the U.S. economy. That's all I have. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Ed Guccella. Mac?
Yeah, I would just say, on the economic side, I hear every word of what you're saying, right? My members are never going to let me build a project that I can't prove out the economics. So it's, you know, at the end of the day, one of the reasons that we're taking longer, I think, than people had originally anticipated was so we can fundamentally understand what the economics are and then what the build costs are, so we know whether or not we can ultimately end up funding it. So if you look at just base economics, it's about $1.3 billion spend roughly, and you'll generate about $2.6 billion worth of tax credits. So how does it even feasible? Is fundamentally you end up with operating costs that come out of that, financing costs that come out of that. And I think it's not a function of whether or not you can ultimately do it. It's really a function of whether or not, to the point you just made, people will take the risk from a technology perspective, from an investment perspective on the return. So today I can run a pro forma that suggests to me I can make it work today. The question will be, can I make it work at a risk profile that someone will spend the money to make the investment in? And that's fundamentally when we figure out the exact costs are and run it back through. You may very well be right at the end of the day, the economics at $50 a ton don't work. Today I can run a pro forma that suggests that it does.
Thank you, Mac. Is there anybody else from the public that would like to have a few minutes with us today briefly? Okay. We'll start expediting. Our clock has run out on us, but we'll keep going because you're here. So go right up to the podium.
Hi, my name is Sam Wagner. I'm from Castleton, North Dakota. I have a few issues with the safety of the project. In my research that I've done over the years talking about pipelines, we found that pipelines have the inherent risk. The technology being used is considered to be experimental by many people. And right now we have roughly about 5,000 miles of pipeline, CO2 pipeline in the United States, and currently that kills about 100 workers a year. I just wanted to ask, with the safety concerns, what's being done to ensure the safeties of your plant workers with the pipelines coming, 5 miles, and also by your statement, the fact that you'll be injecting the carbon dioxide gas directly below your plant, as well. I've been told by my research that this would be around 2,000 PSI, which is comparable to that as a volcano. So, 1 year down the road, maybe we're okay, 2 years down the road, but what is it when we're getting to the 30 or 40 year mark? How can we make sure that that is a, safe and stable area to store the CO2? And finally, I'd just like to talk to the committee about a incident in Mississippi where a CO2 pipeline burst, hospitalizing 49 people, killing animals in the area as well. This project is also asking for an aquifer exemption, which would also inject, which would be inferring that they would be injecting the CO2 through or around an aquifer of some sort. My other question with this is how can we ensure the safety of the aquifer or be able to retrieve the water in case of a drought, which we currently experience here in western North Dakota? Thank you very much. That's all I have to say.
Okay. There's a lot of pieces to that. So I'll take the last one first, which is we're also looking at, so the CO2 well is called a class 6 well, and that's CO2 down into the 5,000 and 10,000 feet. We're also working with the state right now, though, on a well that'll go about 1,000 foot down. That'll go into a saline solution where we have some water that comes out of this process and actually out of the plant process over the long haul that needs to be ultimately stored. It won't all evaporate. So that portion of it, not all that uncommon or different. Coal Creek today, for example, uses a class 1 water injection well into saline aquifers. So you're talking about water that's unusable for any purpose. In terms of what we're looking at. So the water side of this, or the aquifer side of it, doesn't really have anything to do with the CO2 portion of storage. It has to do with a set of other processes going on at the plant. The safety side of it, you are correct in that it doesn't matter whether it's a water pipe or a CO2 pipe or a natural gas pipe or any pipe in the world has a chance to rupture or burst. And so clearly for us, we run, if you ever go out to the Young Station, you'll see, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of feet, hundreds of thousands of feet of high pressure pipe today. And that entire thing is one big piece of pipe that moves liquids around today. So, we are very conscientious about when you start to put pressure in a pipe and what happens with respect to that at the facility itself. I would share with you, I would worry significantly more about the rupture of a steam line than I would about the CO2 pipe portion of it as it relates to what we're talking about. You have a lot more danger in the facility itself in terms of the number of liquids and the number of pressures and the steam pressures that are moving around there than we do what we're talking about in the CO2. I'm not trying to minimize it, but it is a part of an industrial process just like that which we do today and in the rest of the facility.
Sam, thank you for coming from Castleton. I think I saw Senator Pepcorn, and we'll start expediting here. Our people are, and then we'll go to one more after Senator Pepcorn. Two more briefly. We'll keep it quick, but we'll go forward. If you're okay with this, are you okay, Mac, hanging in there? Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Strand, for chairing this committee and other members of the committee as well. I'm Merrill Pepcorn, longtime resident of Fargo. I live at 1321 3rd Street North, District 44. I also happen to serve in the state senate, which due to redistricting now places this very building in my district, District 44. Now I realize you don't live in this building, but nonetheless I'll be proud to represent this area of our city in the legislature.
We're glad to hear that. That means we can ask you for money then, Merle? Or?
Absolutely. We're willing to give out money to support the coal industry, of course, and the city of Fargo is always welcome in the legislature. You know that from being out there several times. But at any rate, I'll make this quick. In my view, the creation of the Clean and Sustainable Energy Authority is in many ways propping up the coal industry. And climate, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, it actually gave the authority, the law gave the authority to the state of North Dakota, this Clean and Sustainable Energy Authority, had not a purchaser for the Coal Creek Station and had not one come forth, it would have given that authority and right to that authority, the state of North Dakota actually purchasing that mine. Now, Mr. Grishella made his point about climate change. That is a legitimate argument for reducing fossil fuel consumption and use. But there's another aspect of it that I look at too. Minnesota is going green. A lot of the companies, Great River Energy Company, Xcel Energy, and we spend tens of millions of dollars trying to convince Minnesota consumers that our coal-fired energy is clean and it is renewable and it is reliable. And no matter how, it's kind of a PR campaign in many aspects. And my contention is times are changing. We can't dig our heels into the past economy, or in this instance, the source of our energy. And it's, if we want to spend tens of millions of dollars convincing people that this is their energy and they don't want it, we've got to do something. We have to change. I would much rather see money spent at the UND's Energy and Environmental Research Center, the EERC. They do a lot of research on how to burn coal cleaner, how to more efficiently get oil out of the ground. They do a great job at it. They have great minds and great resources because they are funded to do that. I would like to see some of our funding spent on what's next. I'm going to use just one example. I'm not an expert in energy and renewables, although I've been around the conversation a lot. But to spend money on, for example, batteries. That's going to be one of the answers to the solution to the problems that renewables present that Mac has actually brought forth here today. So just a few comments along those lines, just general ideas, and I thank you for the time to share that.
Senator, we do have a research facility here doing working on batteries to make them better and better. My question back to you is, how about nuclear plants? Where do you sit on that?
I think it is, it's something, the big question is, what do we do with the waste? And I think it should definitely be researched. There's not a big appetite in the public for it because of the reputation and things that have happened and accidents and storage and, dumping the nuclear waste on, for example, in Indian reservations and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, again, it's research. If we put more of our resources into researching the future rather than how we can save the past, I just think if we can just kind of lean that way, we'll be better off. Thank you.
Okay, we have two other speakers. We'll keep moving forward. The lady in the front, I didn't catch your name, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Sonia Kay. I'm a resident of Fargo and a member of Cass County Electric Cooperative. And I just want to say real quick that there are two 100 megawatt battery storage projects in the interconnection queue for MISO already, but not to do with Minn Kota. I question the sustainability of Project Tundra. Project Tundra will cost $1.3 billion to complete, but that's not counting cost overruns. Once completed, it will depend upon massive government subsidies in the form of 45Q tax credits in order for the energy it produces to be affordable. These are tax dollars. In order to hide the increased cost of electricity to the consumer, part of their utility bill will be hidden in their tax bill. Without these government subsidies, Project Tundra will be too expensive to operate. The 45Q tax breaks expire after 12 years. What happens after they expire and the plant is too expensive to operate on its own? How much closer to clean energy are we at that point? What happens if the U.S. government decides that the massive subsidy for uneconomic energy production is a waste of taxpayer dollars, and the program is canceled sooner than 12 years? Project Tundra uses up approximately half of the energy produced at the power plant just to capture and store the CO2. That means that if we embrace Project Tundra, we will need to produce twice as much power as we need, half of that power going to carbon capture and half going to the consumers. That is not sustainable. Sustainable is defined as being able to be maintained at a certain rate. Sustainable solutions are long-term, if not indefinite. In the power grid, long-term is measured in terms of multiple decades. The 45Q tax credits expire after only 12 years. It is not a long-term solution. It's not sustainable. Sustainable also refers to conserving an ecological balance by avoiding depletion of natural resources. Contaminating aquifers and threatening our air through leaks is not sustainable. Senator Kramer has stated that the purpose of Project Tundra is to extend the life of a coal plant. Extending the life of a coal plant is not the same as investing in true, clean, sustainable energy. Most of us here that have voiced concerns are part of a group called CLEAN. We believe there are better, more sustainable alternatives to Project Tundra, and we would welcome the opportunity to share these at a later date. Thank you.
Yeah, so couple of things. One, so the 12 versus 20 year portion of it is if we have not put a price on carbon in 12 years, then all of this discussion about how carbon is going to go down is going to be, at least in my perspective, is going to be a moot point, because one of the ways we ultimately are going to get carbon driven down is to either manage it or put a price on it. And so the economic model suggests after year 12 that we have the opportunity, the project will be paid for, the opportunity to either continue to take CO2 out of the atmosphere or close the facility, right? Which is, the facilities aren't designed to run forever today, right? There'll have to be a transition of those assets today. So the economics, to your point about is it sustainable, I don't know the answer to that yet, because I don't know exactly what the final cost is and how all the economics work. But on the other side, I can't today keep the lights on by not having those assets or an asset that produces CO2, right? So I fundamentally will fail in keeping the lights on if I don't have something that I can turn on when the other stuff doesn't work. And so I still have a CO2 footprint from that. The other side of it is, look at in terms of saying we talk about kind of the investment side of it, but let me give you a sense of magnitude. So if today we were to see, and I'll use what I think is a modest number in the world today, $20 a ton for CO2. So that's the economic price of CO2 to help drive that down. And I'll just take half of the output of that facility. I'll shut it down the other half of the time when the wind's blowing. That's $60 million a year, right? $60 million a year is a 15% increase on your rates today. $20 a ton for every ton is about a 30% increase on the rates today. So the other side of this is when I put a price on carbon, or when the world puts a price on carbon, I'm going to have an expense. So I look at Tundra as saying, is it an investment that gives me a chance to get rid of CO2, or an expense that I'm just going to add and pass through and I don't reduce any CO2 because I still have to leave it in place when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. So it's not the transition in the utility industry, you guys, is not going to happen in the next 5 years. I mean, you look even at what's being proposed today is 2050. 2050 is the target. XL, and that's where Tony was here earlier, but XL's target is 2050. Others are 2050 as well. That's 30 years from now. Right now, we don't have the coal plants running in 30 years under the current conditions, right? So there's a multi-year transition here in the utility space to ultimately get where we are, because there's just too much capital invested and too much capital needed to be able to just shut stuff off we have today and transition to something new tomorrow. So, and you know, one of the other things I think, and maybe I'll take a little bit of offense to this, is is, so Minn Kota today is already one of the highest percentage non-carbon based utilities in the United States. 44, if you will, so 55%, if you will, is our coal. The other portion of that, which is substantially higher than most utilities in the country today. So I've already made a substantial amount of investments to move in that direction with, opportunities to continue to do so as we grow. So that's it.
You're actually, Minn Kota's actual nameplate capacity for coal is 67%.
Of my total? It's 55.
We have one more public speaker, and Mac, you're being really, really gracious today. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm guessing there will be an ongoing contribution of this discussion for our community to get a better sense of this topic. Martin, you're the last public speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the other members of this committee and to everyone else. My name is Martin Fredericks. I'm a Fargo citizen. I've lived here most of my life. I'd just like to, this wasn't part of what I prepared, but I think that we are operating from different points of view in the fact that if you were to ask me if I care if one utility or another makes or loses money over the next 30 years, I don't care. What I care about is the fact that fossil fuels and the burning of fossil fuels are damaging our planet and the potential for the human race to continue on this planet. You might call me crazy, but we are already passing tipping points, and we're seeing the impacts of that around the world with the wildfires in the West, with the tsunamis, with the flooding in Eastern Europe. So when we start talking about economics, I don't really care. And if we were being honest about the economics, we'd go back another 50 years and start talking about why we haven't taken into consideration externalities such as healthcare costs from pollution. There are all kinds of other costs that have not been factored into projects for decades that if we really want to be honest about the economics of this, we would have taken into consideration. But I came here today to talk about the 6, and I'll keep this as quick as I can, 6 reasons I oppose Project Tundra and the carbon capture and sequestration in general at this time. First, it's an unproven technology. My understanding is that carbon capture and sequestration has never been successful at the scale proposed for Project Tundra. I really don't want my taxes going toward a questionable project when there are proven methods and solutions we can invest in to address greenhouse gas emissions, global warming, and the truly existential threat of climate change. Second, the prolonging of fossil fuel extraction and use. Carbon capture and sequestration is not a solution to climate change. Instead, it's a delay tactic. In my view, energy companies' support for carbon sequestration and capture is no mystery at all. I believe they are banking on selling the public on carbon capture and sequestration so they can continue their business as usual, extracting the oil, gas, and coal that is damaging our planet, impacting humans in a multitude of negative ways already, and seriously jeopardizing our future. Third, we're kicking the can. Along those same lines, carbon capture and sequestration is simply another way for our generation to kick the can down the road, so to speak. I see this as yet another excuse to delay the difficult decisions and actions that are necessary to truly and effectively deal with global warming, and we're leaving it for future generations to deal with instead. That is absolutely irresponsible. Fourth, more fossil fuel consumption. The operation of a carbon capture and sequestration facility, as everybody here has already agreed, requires a tremendous amount of energy. And that energy is going to have to be generated by burning more fossil fuels. This, again, artificially maintains demand and prolongs fossil fuel companies' carte blanche operation while generating even more greenhouse gas emissions. That makes zero sense. Fifth, water quantity and quality, and I think this is a very important point that nobody's talked about yet. Carbon capture and sequestration processes require a lot of water. North Dakota is already dealing with contaminated groundwater and low aquifer levels, as well as issues with surface water sources. All of this is only going to get worse as the climate continues to change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the United Nations, the scientists there are projecting from around the world, scientists from around the world put this report together, and they are projecting serious drought for this part of the country for the next several decades. So our water availability is going to be a real problem. And it was already a problem back in the late 90s. I was sitting in a meeting where they were projecting Fargo would run out of water in 2040, and that was before we even started factoring in climate change. Taking more water, both from groundwater and surface sources, will negatively impact critical and diminishing water supplies for North Dakota citizens. Further, serious questions remain regarding the potential for carbon leakage into geologic formations and the results of that over time. The European Commission is still studying all of these things. More pipelines and broken promises is the last issue I have. A carbon capture and sequestration facility will become a destination for carbon dioxide, which will need to be transported to the state, and that means more pipelines. My friend Sam talked about this a little bit. I agree with Lisa DeVille, a Dakota Resource Council board member, who was quoted in a January 3rd public news service story regarding the tribal concerns about a CO2 pipeline project that is already proposed across 5 states to get to North Dakota. She said, "This pipeline project is no different than any other pipeline project. Industry is going to say this is the best and safest project ever, when in reality, all pipelines spill or break." Further and finally, in my judgment, Project Tundra raises once again the specter of additional reneging on treaties with Native American tribes and further subjugation of indigenous people's rights. Thank you very much.
Mac, you have the response opportunity.
Well, I just say, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is figure out how do we take CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? I described this at the outset. There are 2 ways to do so, right? One is you don't put it in to start with, and second is you capture it and do something with it in some either permanent storage or some other productive fashion. So it's not really a dialogue around whether or not we should figure out a way to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Our disagreements are about how we go about doing so, right? So this is about fundamentally how do we, and today we can like it or not like it, but the transition is not going to be quick to move from the resources we have today to a new generation of technologies. So somewhere in here is a period of time for which we need to drive down emissions at the same time we keep the lights on. And so that's what this is about, is to continue to use assets that we have today that still have economic value for the membership, assuming that all your guys' points are valid, that we can make the economics work in a way that allows us to transition to a new set of technologies over time. So.
We really have kept people a half hour past the good expectation. But I want to say one thing. And first of all, thank you to you for showing up, coming here from Grand Forks. Thank you, Paul, for arranging this topic today and for a speaker for us to begin to learn as much as we can about it. It's really important. I'm always curious going forward what cities can do, but we'll learn our roles and our opportunities as time unfolds. Last thing I'll say is thank you to the people who showed up from the community, because this all started 2 years ago, right before Thanksgiving, with a public forum where we reached out to the community and asked, do you have thoughts and input for climate action issues? And we heard a lot. We're going to continue to welcome the public input and public citizens and learn from the community and try to be a bridge between the people and the providers as best we can and the policymakers. So that's really valuable, and your graciousness, Mac, for being willing to participate in this. Sure. I'm sure it's not the funnest thing in the world, but you're used to it, and it's part of what we all get to do going forward.
It's not, none of this is easy, as you guys well know. I mean, we're trying to figure out how do you take a machine built over the last 80 years called the electric industry and mold it to a new model. And that's not going to happen tomorrow, right?
So thanks to everybody for showing up. One of our future topics Bruce and I will work on is engaging more citizens and have a focal discussion on public input as a focal point of a meeting, not just a moment to react to other presentations. So our next meeting will be in March. The weather will be better by then. Our streets will be cleaned. Anything else for the good of the order?
Thanks, Ben, for letting us come here.
We stand adjourned.
you.
Thanks, Bruce.